afternoon or evening, depending on where you are around the world. Thank you for joining us for this morning's very exciting webinar on the topic of energy management and energy efficiency in data centres and the launch of the International Review of Energy Efficiency in Data Centres report for the IEA EBC Building Energy Codes Working Group. My name is Holly Taylor and I'm the Head of Projects at the Energy Efficiency Council, which is Australia's peak body for energy management, energy efficiency and demand response. And I'll be your host for the next 90 minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I am located, the Boonwurrung, Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today's webinar covers a topic that might not be front of mind for many of us, but one that we all interact with on a daily basis, whether we realise it or not. In 2020, global internet traffic surged by more than 40% as a result of increased video streaming, conferencing, online gaming, and social networking, as most of us were stuck at home, working remotely, and connecting with loved ones virtually. More broadly, there has been substantial growth in the use of data centres in the last decade. In particular, between 2010 and 2018, it was estimated that worldwide data centre capacity increased by 26 times. With more and more of us saving things in the cloud, it's easy to see how data centre energy consumption has and will continue to skyrocket. Data centres were already significant consumers of energy, with both the servers and the air conditioners used to cool them consuming a lot of electricity. So there is a real need to address the increased environmental impacts associated with data centre emissions now and into the future. So government adoption of policy measures to mitigate this impact is thus of great importance. To address this growing issue, the Australian government commissioned a report to review international policies, standards and issues relating to energy efficiency in data centres, with a focus on policy actions that could be undertaken by the Australian government. A version of this report has been created for an international policy audience as a contribution to the Building Energy Codes Working Group under the International Energy Agency's Energy in Buildings and Communities Technology Collaboration Program, or more simply, the IEA EBC. David Nemzal will give you more of a background on that shortly. So to get the latest on energy efficiency in data centres around the world, we've invited today's speakers to highlight what's going on and what you need to learn. We hope that policymakers around the world will draw some inspiration from the successes identified in the report, and indeed will enjoy the conversation from our experts today. But before we get to the presentations from George and Fiona and Anne, we have a few short remarks from representatives of the organisations involved in facilitating this report and supporting the Building Energy Codes Working Group at the IEA EBC. First up, we'll hear from David Nemzal, co-chair of the Building Energy Codes Working Group within the IEA EBC and senior advisor at the Loan Programs Office within the US Department of Energy. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Holly. Can you hear me okay? Great. And I'm going to share my slides once I figure out the right way to do that. Greetings, everybody. And that should be sharing, yeah? Does that work, Holly?
Not quite, David.
Yeah, no?
Not quite. I can definitely hear the feedback on your end. There's a ding. These things happen.
Is there a plan B? Because my computer thinks it's sharing.
There is totally a plan B. Julianne, who's on the back end of the Energy Efficiency Council, has started sharing the screen for you. So please go ahead, David.
Great. Thank you. And look, first I want to say thanks very much to the Energy Efficiency Council for organizing this meeting. You are not just you're not just Australia's peak body for efficiency, but you're certainly one of the global peak bodies for energy efficiency. And I've worked with you all for many years and hope to continue to do so. I'm here today my day job is working at the United States Department of Energy, but I'm here today in my capacity, as you just heard, as co-chair of the Building Energy Codes Working Group. And right there is a little, if you can follow that first sentence, you pass government, bureaucracy, school. And the Building Energy Codes Working Group has a host of activities in the space of building energy codes. So today we're going to talk about data centers. Let me just tell you about building codes. First, why do we have building codes, and why is there a Building Energy Codes Working Group? I'll let you review this for yourself, but I'll just say building energy codes have been around for decades, and for many years and decades, they had nothing to do with energy, right? They had to do with structural performance, with safety, for fire, et cetera. And then starting the 1970s, countries around the world started adopting them for energy performance. They've had a resurgence in recent years, and I'll give the European Union and its member nations credit for being in the lead on that. And the rest of us around the world, I think, are catching up with them. And the resurgence, of course, is because of the attention to global climate change, especially post the Paris Accord. Building energy codes, like all of energy efficiency, support a host of important energy efficiency goals, including climate mitigation, including saving end users money, including improved performance of the building. But let me add that in this period, with the grotesque and horrific Russian unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, we see much of the world, including my country and certainly European countries, unduly dependent on Russian oil and gas, and building energy codes won't solve that problem in time, but like other measures of building energy efficiency, can lessen the world's dependence on fossil fuels, and especially fossil fuels from dangerous places. Second slide, please. I don't see, is that changed? Help me out, Holly, I'm flying blind.
It most definitely has.
Okay, good. Who, that's why we have a Building Energy Codes group and why we have codes. Who are we? Well, you can see from this map, we are 15 countries that are members. In addition to member countries, we have important code organizations that are part of our working group. ASHRAE and the International Codes Council. These are two bodies that promote model energy codes that jurisdictions can adopt. And I do want to say, while we're looking at a map, even if it is a Mercator projection that gives Greenland and Canada a lot of the real estate, that often codes are adopted, including in my country and in Holly's country and in Brazil, at the state level, at the subnational level, and Canada too. But I just want to say, sometimes it's at the national level, sometimes the EU gets involved on a multinational basis, sometimes at the subnational. But our membership, our 15 member countries, plus those codes bodies, ASHRAE and the ICC, as well as the European Council's Joint Research Center. And we also have, and this is a pitch, individuals who are professionals in the field join us, and they're not formal members, but you don't, if you're not from one of those countries and colored in red, you're still welcome to participate with us. And I don't know what that red dot in the middle of the Pacific is. It looks like Easter Island has just become a member. Well, they're not. All right, so this is who we are, and there is the email of my colleague in the US, Allison Delgado. And if you want to get involved in our activities, please email Allison. Next slide, please. That's the why and the who. What do? We do a variety of activities, and if you go to our homepage at the bottom there that you can see, or again, if you email Allison Delgado, we'll give you more information. We do a series of research reports and analysis, and we're going to discuss some work today. And the working group, and I should have said my co-chairs are Michael Dunn from New Zealand and Melly Stiliano from Natural Resources Canada. So we do some of our work, I'll call it in-house, but not so much. We work with others around the world. You'll hear from several of them today from US national laboratories to do important cutting-edge research in the field of building codes. And we cover a variety of important topics, from some of the traditional issues that have been around for decades, such as how do we promote compliance and enforcement? No good to have a code on paper if people aren't complying with it, all the way through to emerging issues such as how do we factor in photovoltaics, grid interactivity, and electric vehicles into building energy codes? Or what about data centers, which we'll discuss today? So that's one set of issues. I'll show you a list, and we share them through webinars, which we do periodically that are interactive. Today is but one of them. We have a quarterly newsletter. We have informal outreach and dialogue among people who are interested in building energy codes. And then we have other activities. For example, we've provided, my colleague Meredith Evans of the Pacific Northwest National Lab provided expert guidance into the IPCC's buildings chapter on the role of building codes in dealing with climate. Those are some of the activities we do. And again, we welcome your participation. And finally, the last slide is just a further sales pitch, just to restate what I just showed on that one. So there are a couple of our reports. You can see there, but you can't see what's inside them. But if you can judge a report by its cover, you can see we take the report seriously to try to communicate the importance of building codes, but also the challenges with them. And here is a list. I hope I got them all, Allison, of the past webinars we've held on different topics, and we'll be having them going forward. So that's our Building Energy Code Working Group, and I will. That's all I will say. And again, I thank the Energy Efficiency Council as well as the experts from who we'll be hearing from today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. And it's really great to see how much effective work the Building Energy Codes Working Group is doing. And with that in mind, we're going to get into some of the work that other governments are doing and indeed the recent report. So before we do that, it'd be really great to hear from Stanford Harrison, who's the Manager of Commercial Buildings Policy within the Industrial Energy Efficiency branch at the Australian Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. Indeed, the EEC works really closely with Stanford and his team to ensure that the work of the International Energy Agency's Energy in Buildings and Communities, or TCP, so the IEA EBC, so many acronyms in the TCPs, is working efficiently in Australia.
Holly, you're gonna fail the bureaucracy test, Holly, if you can't get your acronyms right.
Oh, I'm just going to remind everybody.
Stanford and I are expert bureaucrats due to our memorization of acronyms.
Just going to remind everyone, it's just gone 7 a.m. in Australia, so it's definitely very early. But with that in mind, Stanford, it would be wonderful to hear from you.
Hi, Holly. Yes, that's right. No, just be very brief. Yeah, David got a really good overview of the overall umbrella under which we're working today, and just to add, the Building Energy Codes Working Group allows that lens of energy use and emissions to be looked at, and of course this international forum allows us to look at shared issues across nations. On that, I just really like to acknowledge that the particular report that Fiona Brocklehurst will be talking about as part of Australia's contribution, and really like to, in the spirit of collaboration, which is the C within the TCP, Technical Collaboration Programs, spirit of collaboration, we'd really like to thank everybody who's generously contributed their expertise and time towards the production, and of course Fiona in her work as well. So now I hand over to the next one.
Awesome, thanks Stanford. So noting that Australia and the US have massively been leading on this, I would love to now introduce you to Jeffrey Murrell, Data Center Program Manager within the US Department of Energy's Federal Energy Management Program. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Holly. Greetings from Washington, D.C. In Section 1003 of the Energy Act of 2020, the DOE Secretary, in collaboration with key stakeholders, which includes our good friends with the International Energy Association, the BECWG, also our friends with the U.S. Office of Management and Budget and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Shell actively participate in efforts to harmonize global specifications and matrix for data center energy and water efficiency. With our DOE, particularly the Federal Energy Management Program that I happen to be part of, in collaboration with our good friends with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Lawrence Berkeley Center of Expertise for energy efficiency in data centers. We are working to help promote the Biden administration goal of decarbonizing our data centers. Because again, we want to make sure that we have a much better world for our friends, families, and our loved ones in the future. And with that, I'd also like to give you greetings from the DOE FEMP Director, Mary Santos, and also from the DOE Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, in which David and myself work for. And also like to give thanks to Ian Huffman, who's with Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, who you'll hear later talk about data center standards for not only the United States, but in the spirit of cooperation with China and with India. So with that, thank you so much, Holly. Thank you, everybody. Greetings from the United States.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So now I just want to quickly run everyone through the order of proceedings for this morning or evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. First, we'll hear from an expert from the International Energy Agency, who has led the development of their tracking report on data centers. Secondly, we'll hear from the author of the International Review of Energy Efficiency in Data Centers report. And last, but definitely not least, from a United States-based expert about the state of energy efficiency in data centers around the world, with specific case studies from the US. Following these presentations from each of these fantastic speakers, we'll hold a panel discussion during which we encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A function. I definitely encourage everyone to get on the Q&A as the presentations are happening, though please note that we won't get back to your questions until after the presentations, but there's no harm in writing them as they come up. So I'm really looking forward to hearing our speakers' perspectives on the state of energy efficiency in data centers around the world. And with that, I'd like to invite our first speaker for today, George Camilla, Energy Policy Analyst at the International Energy Agency. George leads the IEA's analysis on energy and climate impacts of digital technologies and was a lead author of the agency's 2017 Digitalization and Energy Report. He also contributes to the agency's work on other emerging topics, including critical minerals, electricity security, and new mobility. George will present findings from the IEA's recent report, Data Centers and Data Transmission Networks, and indeed, George was the lead author of this. Over to you, George.
Thanks very much, Holly. Hopefully my slides are showing up.
They most definitely are.
Great, thanks. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try to provide a bit of a scene setter, I guess, providing kind of summarizing the latest research that's out there and providing kind of broader context on the energy impacts of data centers. So, as we all know, data centers are at the heart of the ongoing digital transformation globally, and digitalization is happening very quickly, especially when we compare digitalization indicators with economic or energy indicators like GDP or electricity use. So, looking at the number of internet users have grown by more than 10 times since 2000. Global internet traffic is up more than 2,000 times. And because of this rapid pace of growth, there's a perception out there that the energy and emissions from digital technologies are also growing very quickly. So here's a headline from 1999 in Forbes that predicted that the internet would use half of all US electricity by 2010. In reality, data center energy use in the US actually grew quite rapidly in between 2000 and 2010, but got to around 2% of total electricity. So not 50% as predicted, and has since been fairly flat since 2010. When we look at the global picture over the last 10 years, data center energy use has grown by about 10 to 20%, whereas data center workloads, it's a measure of service demand, and internet traffic globally has grown by almost 10 times and 20 times respectively. So quite a divergence between service demand and energy growth. So excluding cryptocurrency mining, which I'll touch on a bit later, data centers globally use around 200 to 250 terawatt hours of electricity, which is about 1% of global electricity use. The energy efficiency improvements we've seen in data centers and ICT more generally have been really quite remarkable. At the IT hardware level, the energy efficiency of servers, storage, and networking equipment have improved rapidly. We've also seen a broader shift away from smaller, less efficient enterprise data centers to cloud and hyperscale data centers, which are much more efficient, both in terms of computing and cooling. I mentioned that data center energy use has grown only slightly over the past decade at the global level, but I think here it's worth highlighting that some countries are actually seeing very rapid growth over the past few years. So for example, in Ireland, data center energy use has more than doubled between 2015 and 2020, and they now account for more than 10% of the country's overall electricity use. So the next question then is, will these efficiency trends continue into the future? We've seen headlines like these ones raising alarms that data center energy use will soar over the coming decade. But if we dig into the sources, these headlines actually rely on a worst case scenario from an old 2015 study. In fact, the lead author of that study has acknowledged that he had underestimated energy efficiency progress and has since drastically cut his estimates in more recent publications. The reason it's so hard to make energy projections for data centers is that demand drivers are changing very quickly and they're very, very difficult to predict. So if we look just back on the past 10 years, we've seen smartphones become mainstream, new generations of mobile networks, much more streaming media, but also huge energy efficiency improvements to keep energy use in check. But now we're seeing emerging technologies like blockchain, machine learning, and 5G. And it's very hard to predict how new applications and services that are built on top of these core technologies could impact data demand and energy use over the next 10 to 20 years. And if we look at some of these emerging technologies and services, the impacts on data center and data center energy use can vary quite significantly. So for example, streaming video doesn't require too much computing power from data centers. So actually most of the energy impacts come from viewing devices and home networking equipment. It's worth pointing out here that the ICT sector more generally includes data transmission networks and connected devices, and that data centers account for just under 30% of overall ICT electricity use. If we look at AI and machine learning, on the other hand, it's very computationally intensive. So companies have developed specialized hardware, so-called ASICs, that are both faster and more energy efficient than general purpose processors. So in this chart, for example, you can see that a specialized chip for ML is 30 to 80 times more energy efficient than a contemporary CPU or GPU. Companies are also working to reduce power consumption through better software and model design. So this chart shows how more efficient model design and hardware combine to improve energy efficiency of AI operations at Facebook by about 20% every 6 months. But some of these gains are negated due to ever-increasing demand. So data from Facebook on the left, you can see that demand for ML is more than doubling each year, while overall data center energy use on the right is growing at around 40% a year. So this means that even strong efficiency improvements that we saw in the previous slides may not be able to keep up with growing service demand from these emerging technologies. I think Bitcoin provides another interesting example of demand outpacing efficiency. The latest specialized hardware for Bitcoin mining is well over 1 million times more energy efficient than CPUs and GPUs that mined Bitcoin back in the early 2010s. But overall electricity use for Bitcoin mining has actually gone up by 30 times in just 5 years. Today, Bitcoin mining consumes around 140 terawatt hours per year, which, to put into context, is more than twice as much as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook combined. Just to briefly touch on the clean energy side of the equation, many of the big data center operators are also the biggest corporate buyers of renewable electricity in the world. So in this chart, you can see the ICT sector has been accounting for about half of all corporate renewable purchases. Some of these data center companies have already reached so-called 100% renewables, meaning that they're buying enough renewables each year to match the amount of electricity they're using in their operations. But these companies can certainly do more by using clean electricity 24/7 at all their locations, not just on a global annual basis. And as operational electricity decarbonizes, it'll become even more important to decarbonize supply chains. In other words, energy and embodied emissions from materials extraction and manufacturing of hardware and infrastructure. And before I wrap up, I'd like to put this kind of all into broader context of reaching net zero emissions globally by 2050. Holly mentioned our annual Tracking Clean Energy Progress Report, which includes a page on data centers and networks. And we found that only 2 out of 46 energy technologies and sectors listed here are on track with the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. 18 technology areas need further improvements, including data centers, and 26 are not on track. This means that in order to reach net zero emissions globally by 2050, we need to rapidly decarbonize all sectors of the economy, so all the emission sources you see here. And I think this is where digital technologies and data centers could have a significant effect on emissions. Of course, there are direct emissions from the energy that we've been talking about building and powering data centers, networks, and computers. But these amount to slightly less than 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions today. But how these technologies are used in other sectors can also have an enormous impact on overall global emissions. Some of these effects will lead to emission reductions, the so-called enabling effect, while others could actually increase emissions through rebound effects or induced consumption. So the key message here is that data centers and digitalizations do have an environmental footprint, and we should work to reduce these to zero. But we also need to be mindful of how digital technologies like machine learning could be used in other sectors that lead to much larger impact on global emissions, both positively and negatively. So just to wrap up, a few key takeaways. Energy efficiency has played really a central role in moderating energy use and emissions from digital technologies, especially data centers. But we're expecting demand for these digital services to continue to grow into the future. So we need to make even more progress on energy efficiency. I think this also means investing in RD&D for more efficient next generation technologies that we'll need in the coming years. Decarbonizing electricity systems and decarbonizing supply chains. We also need more robust data and approaches to analysis. Certainly in this area, we've seen a lack of data. This is an area where I think companies and governments need to work together so we can develop better indicators and track progress on how we're doing. So with that, I'll hand it over back to you, Holly. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, George. I really like that you ended on the importance of data for energy efficiency and indeed just generally if we want to reduce anything, it's a really good point. However, my favorite takeaway from what you just said is that Facebook is increasing its data centers by 40% year on year. So next time a young person that's younger than all of us comes along and says Facebook's dead, no one's paying attention to it, we're just going to remind everybody that baby boomers and older, and indeed those of us that are Gen X and Gen Y as millennials, are still using Facebook, and there's more and more people joining it. So that was a nice little tidbit for me as a bit of enjoyment. Thanks, George. So with that in mind, I'd love to now welcome the lead author of the report that's being launched today, the International Review of Energy Efficiency in Data Centres for the IEA EBC Building Energy Codes Working Group, and that's Fiona Brocklehurst. Fiona's actually here today, but she has pre-recorded her presentation to enable her to stay on track in terms of time, because there's obviously a lot of information in the report and she wants to make sure she's clearly stated it. So whilst it is a pre-recorded presentation, she will be here for the conversation later on. So Fiona is a sustainable energy consultant with significant experience in renewable energy and energy efficiency. She has previously provided R&D program and policy support to several UK government departments as part of the energy consultancy group AEA Technology. Fiona has operated as an independent consultant since 2010, providing expert support to international and national public sector organisations. Having completed an international review of policy in the area focused not just focused on the Australian context, but for international audiences as well, there is no doubt that Fiona has a wealth of knowledge on this topic. So Fiona now, via the pre-record, is going to present the findings from the International Review of Policy Solutions for Improving Energy Efficiency in Data Centres. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about the report for the BECWG. So briefly talk about the report, how it came to be, a little bit of context, hopefully without repeating too much what George has already said. And the report covers a lot of different areas, but in this talk I'm going to concentrate on what I found in terms of possible policy pathways. The report was commissioned by DZER, and you've heard from Stanford, who led that team. The operating agent for BECWG are US Pacific Northwest, and that was led by Meredith Evans. The original version of this report was focused on Australia, directly for DZER, so this is a broadened, more international version. So there are some advantages in digitalisation, of which data centres are part of that picture, in terms of increased efficiency. For example, using controls, you can reduce energy waste, and by managing using smart devices, you can manage when demand happens and thereby reduce emissions, and also reduce costs. On the other hand, the digital infrastructure in itself can create emissions and use water. So how do you balance that, and how can you reduce the environmental impact of the data centres in this case? So it won't surprise anybody to know that there's been really substantial growth in demand for data centre services. This data is just for 8 years, from 2010 to 2018, measured in a number of different ways, but all the increases are really quite substantial. In terms of energy, and the good news is that there have been considerable efficiency gains. It's been really, again, we've got different measures here. There isn't one universal metric, but those are substantial increases. So then the paper which I took these data from estimated that energy use has stayed more or less level in data centres despite those really big increases in demand. So what about into the future? There are quite a number of estimates of that, and they have a very considerable range, as you can see. From the best case is around 200 terawatt hours a year globally, which is around where we are now, to heading for 3,000 terawatt hours in 2030, which is obviously a considerable increase. So what's the question I suppose everyone wants to ask is, how do we get to the best case? How do we keep energy use low and possibly not even increasing when you've got much increased demand? So how has it happened so far, these efficiency improvements? There are 3 areas. So there's the structural change from small scale and in-house to cloud and hyperscale, which are generally much more efficient. Then there is the IT side, the servers. They've also increased in efficiency substantially. And the third aspect is the infrastructure, so predominantly cooling, but also electricity demand. Those have all increased and give us improvements. But those sorts of improvements are not spread across the sector. They're concentrated in certain areas. The upside to this is that there is scope for much more energy savings without any new technology, but it needs policy and push and pull to spread this good practice from the largely large-scale people who have lots of expertise and incentives in terms of reducing costs to adopt these things, to the smaller scale where there isn't the in-house knowledge, or there might even not be separate metering, so they don't know how much they could save or would save. So now I'm going to move on to the policy options. I found 8 different types of policies in my review, quite a range. I'm going to briefly describe each type now with a few examples. So we'll start with reporting or declaring performance, asking the whole market to do that. The difference being, if it's declared, then the results are published. There aren't any adopted examples of this, but last year the EU did propose in a revision of a major regulation that large data centres would be required to report. So some fairly substantial advantages from that. Firstly, that if something has to be reported, then it automatically gets management attention. And that could drive adoption of good practice, and then it can also help governments identify the areas of highest impact, so where they can prioritise their policies. And then with or without policies, it's useful to track progress. Is efficiency improving, and how much is demand increasing? And last but not least, it can drive competition. Inevitably, if things are reported, people will draw up league tables, and some companies will always seek to be at the top. Now we come on to minimum energy performance standards, or MEPS. This is the area that I mostly work in. MEPS have been shown to be very effective at saving energy and also having very excellent benefit to cost ratios. I found 2 examples on the IT side. There's a regulation in the EU for servers, and in Japan for computers, including large-scale computers as the type you'd have in data centres. It has an advantage in increasing IT efficiency, because then they generate less waste heat, and you have to use less infrastructure energy to get rid of it. So you have this lovely multiplier effect. Another option which has been adopted just last year in China is actually setting a MEPS for the whole of a data centre. I have some reservations about that, in that there isn't a great metric for data centre efficiency as a whole, and the one that's adopted has some issues, but it is one way of moving forward. Next we come on to building codes. They can nicely complement MEPS because they can address the infrastructure energy use in HVAC and electrical. I found a couple of examples both in states, in California and in Washington. One potential downside to building codes is they largely only apply to new buildings, and while there are lots of data centres being built, as I've already indicated, part of the big problems are in the older ones. So one sort of supplementary policy which exists in the EU is to require regular inspection of HVAC equipment to check that it is maintaining its efficiency. A number of countries already have schemes or obligations on different types of industry to increase their energy efficiency. So another option is to extend those schemes to include data centres. So an example I found was in the Netherlands, where commercial data centres are one of the sectors. They have to, there are a sort of shopping list of energy saving measures with short payback periods, which are specific to their sector, and they're obliged to adopt them. Other schemes out there include providing or subsidising energy audits and other technical supports, and setting targets in various different ways. So another option is providing good practice advice. This doesn't need to mean starting from scratch. There's a huge amount of excellent advice already out there. Here are some other providers. For example, the EU Data Centre Codes of Conduct is what it says, but also provides publicly available information. But it's important that this is a fast-moving technological area, so it's important that that's kept up to date, and as for example LBL already does, provide information for the very different scales of data centres that there are out there, from the small to the large. And it's not enough for it to just be there and on some website. People need to be made aware that it exists, and to sell it, to provide reasons for them to adopt it. And if it can be used, other policies can provide the pull for people to look at and adopt good practice. So next up is financial incentives. There are a couple that are current at the moment, both, as it turns out, in the EU or in Europe. One example in France, of which there's still not a huge, it was announced last year, but there's not a huge amount of information about it that I can find. Another is the UK climate change agreements, where co-location data centres are one of the 50 sectors who qualify for that. And in both cases, the country has a electricity environmental tariff, and the qualifying data centres get a partial or complete rebate for that. So not every country obviously has that particular situation, but I think most countries have some way of providing a financial incentive to energy efficiency, meeting targets for energy efficiency. Another option is to use public sector influence. The public sector can own and operate large data centres. They can also buy a lot of data centre services. Either way, they can have a direct influence over what the quality, the energy efficiency of the products they use. Examples include the US federal one, which I'm hoping that Ian will cover off. Then there is the New South Wales environmental procurement policy, which sets a requirement that suppliers have to use the neighbours, meet a star rating value using the neighbours rating tool, which I'll come on to next. And then there are procurement guidance, and there's a couple of examples here, one EU-wide and one specific to the Netherlands. They can include, all of these can include more complex sort of requirements than you can set under a MEPS or a building regulation. They can require you to report and to regularly and to demonstrate competencies in the particular providers. And they can be exemplars, saying not only here we are providing best practice, we're actually following it ourselves, and that can be quite powerful in its own right. Also included in here, there are some voluntary initiatives which government can encourage industry to join. And the examples here are the EU Code of Conduct, which I've talked about already, and also in the EU, the Climate Neutral Data Centre Pact. So last but not least, we come to voluntary labels or certificates. There's quite a variety of these. Some of them are buildings-based certificate schemes, and I alluded to one of them, Neighbours, which operates in Australia and has a particular version that covers data centres. Then, on that same sort of line, then we have Beam Plus in Hong Kong. Energy Star has a data centres building version in the US. And then there is LEED, which operates internationally. Then there are also sort of environmental labels like Blue Angel, which operate in Germany, that has a particular label for data centres. And then there are also some certificates that have been developed specifically for data centres. So for example, we have the Swiss Data Centre Efficiency label and the data centre certification scheme. So all of these, or any of these, can be used to support other policies. We had the example of Neighbours being used in the New South Wales procurement guidance, but they could be used as a way of demonstrating good practice, meeting voluntary or mandatory requirements for data centres, so they can be very much enabling policies. So each one of those policies can make a difference in their own right, but they can really build on each other and be more effective together. For example, as I've discussed, labels can enable procurement, incentives and industry schemes, and reporting or declaring performance can all drive take-up of best practice. So I would say the more the better in this situation. So that's the end of my run through all the different policy options. We'll be taking questions with the panel at the end of the last presentation. So I look forward to talking to you then. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that pre-record, Fiona. And again, apologies for the issues with the internet not always working as well as we would like it to in Australia. But don't worry, in the actual record, we will put the better quality video, and indeed we will share the slides with you all after the fact. So last but definitely not least, I would really like to hear from Ian Hoffman, who's an energy technology and policy analyst at the Centre for Expertise for Energy Efficiency in Data Centres at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories in the US. Ian's going to provide us an overview of how the US has supported the adoption of federal statutes and policies to drive down emissions and to decarbonise data centres. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Holly. So first off, I do want to reinforce that Fiona has issued a truly wonderful report. We got to review it early on, and it is packed full of really useful information for policymakers. Really couldn't endorse it strongly enough. So I'm going to talk very briefly, I hope, about the regulatory landscape for U.S. data centers. It's a fairly complicated landscape. It's highly distributed, includes codes, standards, a little dose of federal law, and a lot of roles for the federal government, but chiefly states and even local governments. We're going to focus on building energy standards and codes. We're going to talk briefly about the Federal Data Center Optimization Initiative. I think we may run out of time before talking about any of the burgeoning interest in regulation of crypto mining, and so maybe we can kind of cover that with Q&A. So all the way through the 2000s, there was no building or equipment standards for data center energy to speak of. Data centers were classified as special spaces, quote unquote, and exempted from commercial energy standards. That exemption was removed in 2010. One of our standards writing organizations, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, ASHRAE, I'm sorry, are you not seeing slides?
Julianne's just going to share them for you. Apologies, Ian, they are not coming up.
Sorry about that.
So
are they showing now?
The first one is, but that might have been Julianne. So which slide do you want?
I tell you what, I think, is that Julianne?
I believe that is Julianne, yes.
Lovely, so Julianne, thank you very much for rescuing me. Okay.
Ian, just let me know which slide you'd like me to land on.
Yes, if you could jump to the next one. And the next one beyond that, please. Okay. So as I said, there was really nothing before 2010. And then in 2010, the exemption for data centers was lifted and replaced largely by a singular focus, a prescriptive focus on airside economizing. More recently, that approach has diversified, and data centers have gained their own energy standard that has both mechanical and electrical components to it, and are differentiated by load, and in the case of mechanical performance, by climate. Next slide, please. And so why was there a data center code? Chiefly, it was driven by the industry and its lack of happiness with the previous approach, with the prescriptive approach. And the perception of the industry was that data centers are unique. They're mission critical. They have minimal human occupancy compared to commercial spaces, compared to commercial codes. Failure, even for very short periods of time, is not an option for some data centers. The cost can be astronomical. There can be life safety implications. There are high power and heat densities, much higher than you have in your typical commercial office space. And they are coupled with specialized cooling systems. And the shell of these structures is kind of rendered largely irrelevant by those densities. Perhaps most importantly, from the industry perspective, was that a prescriptive path was not seen as sufficiently nimble for the industry, that it was not encouraging to innovation in what is inherently a fast evolving industry. Data centers are constantly innovating. We're seeing a lot of dramatic technology changes each year. I think George made reference to kind of the emergence now of ASICs chips and the efficiency that's come along with them. We'll hopefully have an opportunity later to talk about liquid cooling, liquid immersion cooling. Anyway, but the heat and computational densities continue to increase, and these changes are often occurring too rapidly for any single approach, prescriptive approach, to really keep up with. Next slide. And so in I believe it's 2013, ASHRAE engineers began working on data center energy standard 90.4. It was, the first one was issued in 2016, and it is a performance-based standard. It recognizes the mission critical nature of data centers, and it also differentiates that, you know, not every room with some IT equipment in it is a data center, and so there are these capacity breaks in the standard, and so you can see those kind of listed down at the bottom there. It's essentially data centers are north of 10 kW and with a power density of at least 20 watts per square foot. Let's see, next slide, please. And so the standard as it was devised what was imagined as a sister standard to the commercial building energy code standard, and it primarily works through these two mechanisms. It's there's a series of values for the mechanical load component. It is again differentiated by capacity and by climate zone. And it's essentially a sum of the mechanical infrastructure loads as a share of the overall IT capacity. Similarly, on the electrical side, the focus there is on losses upstream of the IT equipment as reflected as a share of IT capacity. Again, also with a capacity break, albeit a slightly different one than on the mechanical side. And so if you want to comply with the standard, you can comply with each of these separately, or you can kind of add the two values, these two measures of loss or load versus IT, and you can comply with that, combine that aggregate number. Next slide, please. Actually, if you could go back one, let me just make one more quick point there. There was a fair amount of debate about whether or not PUE would be a good foundation for the standard and therefore the codes that hopefully would flow from it. And the folks who worked on the standard rejected that idea, thought that it's a PUE, power usage effectiveness, is a good operational standard, but not really great as a design standard. And it's not very comparable between data centers. If you want to have fairness and equity in the imposition of the standard, the thought was you need to get away from PUE. And there was also a concern that a design-based, a PUE used in a design context would mislead the owners to actually expect to achieve their design PUEs, which is highly uncommon. So next slide, if you will. So what actually happened with these standards? So on this map is chiefly a map of the adoption of building energy codes. I think we mentioned, David at the very top mentioned that in the United States, along with a few other countries, that the regulatory framework in the United States has states adopting the building energy codes. And then it devolves even further down to the local level for the inspection and enforcement of those codes. Everything you see here in kind of orange and white, those are places that have codes, that have older commercial building energy codes that have exempts, that either there's no code or the code doesn't apply to data centers. Where we actually have codes that are akin to that ASHRAE standard 90.4 that we talked about is in Washington and in California. Oregon is kind of headed in that direction, but it's out here kind of in the western part of the United States where we see some significant movement. Obviously, the folks at ASHRAE hope that movement spreads to other states in the not too distant future. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the Washington State Energy Code essentially borrows heavily from the very first version of ASHRAE 90.4. It has those same kind of electric loss component values. It has slightly more stringent mechanical load component values. And partly that's a reflection of the different climate, but it's also Washington's desire to be a bit tighter. Those were initially effective in January 2020. It's on a 3-year update cycle, just like ASHRAE 90.4. And they're in the process of updating to the current standard, ASHRAE standard, which is 90.4 for 2019. Next slide, please. California got into the regulation of energy and data centers in 2013. So really the first state to meaningfully grapple with energy efficiency in data centers from a code standpoint. It's also on a 3-year update and compliance training cycle. They're in the process of updating for 2022. Data centers are also, they are required. We had a little bit of conversation earlier about the value of using information as a complement to compliance with code. That also occurs here in California. Data centers are required to report their annual usage to the California Energy Commission. California does define computer rooms and data centers somewhat differently than ASHRAE does. In essence, the density thresholds are about the same, but a computer room is inherently part of a data center in the California definition. So California's approach is similar to a combination of 90.1 and 90.4, ASHRAE 90.1 and 90.4, in that there is a prescriptive path and then there is a performance path. And so the prescriptive path is very much focused on economizing. It's on cooling system efficiency, particularly fan and cooling compressor agents, energy. Larger data centers, and not even really that large, anything with greater than 175 kW of design load, has to have air containment, so hot and cold aisles. And there is required electrical metering in to varying degrees depending on the load. And there are some now proposals for limited exemptions for economizers, say in jurisdictions where they discourage cooling towers. Next slide, please. So just briefly on the previous 2 slides, I do want to emphasize again, and maybe we'll get an opportunity to talk about this, but again, the enforcement of these codes comes down to the local level, and it is highly dependent upon the priorities of those local inspectors and what their resources are. And so what we often find is that data centers are being located in rural areas where the inspections department does not really have an abundance of resources, and going through engineers' calculations, compliance calculations is not necessarily something that they're always trained up on. So suffice to say that enforcement is uneven, even moving within the same state. Let's see. Just briefly, the federal government has engaged in a bit of regulation of data center energy for its own data centers. This began back in 2010. It was an effort to, an administrative effort to kind of control growth. It was very rapid, continuous, steady state growth in federal data centers. Congress replied legislatively with an even more aggressive steps towards containing that growth by mandating that agencies consolidate essentially do a lot of cloud migration and consolidate their data center fleets. In 2016, during the Obama administration, the White House launched the Data Center Optimization Initiative. It had mandates to report energy and costs and the cost savings, and originally had some PUE targets associated with it. At that point in time, there were, the count was about 11,000, almost 12,000 federal data centers estimated, and there was a big focus again on migrating to the cloud. But there has always been some enduring ambiguity on some of the metrics that apply on the IT side. So we're talking about virtualization and even more importantly, utilization. We can talk more about those metrics later if anybody wants to get into it during Q&A. During the last administration, the initiative was revised to remove smaller data centers and to remove those PUE targets. And all of a sudden, the data center count that was subject to the regulation dropped down to about 2,600, so cut by more than a quarter. So of late, though, the judgment has been that federal agencies have largely complied with the administrative requirements. And there's a scorecard with an alphabetical ranking, and every agency that is subject to these requirements has gotten an A. And so now they're looking at, well, what else can we expand upon our metrics? What else might we be looking at besides energy and besides cost savings? There's a lot of consideration given to cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, regulation of data center efficiency in the United States is fairly fragmented and really still at an early stage, but it is growing and evolving. It takes the form of building energy standards and codes. And we didn't talk about it much, but there are equipment standards, as Fiona referred to. And most of the leadership on that has come in the States, with leading with California and a number of other states that look to California as a template for their own codes, for their own standards, excuse me. And as we discussed, there are some statutory or administrative requirements for federal data centers unique to those. There is no consensus quantification of the energy impacts of any of these regulations. Particularly the building energy standards and codes. I think there's a fair amount, as George was referring to earlier, there's a fair amount of evidence that the efficiency of data centers has more than kept pace with the growth in demand. And so something clearly is working, but the temptation, I think, is to say that a large portion of that is migration to hyperscale facilities, highly efficient hyperscale facilities in the cloud. But anecdotally, we do hear that some of those early requirements for economizers did indeed walk back energy use in many places. Like I said, there is an emerging interest in regulating crypto mining for energy and emissions impacts. We can get into that in Q&A as desired. Next slide, please. Is that it? No? Okay, good enough. Thanks very much.
Awesome, thanks, Ian. It was really nice to see how you were talking about how whilst there's fragmented policies and standards in the US, there actually is a lot of different stuff happening. So there's great opportunity for other countries around the world to learn from what has been happening in the US, even if it is at a jurisdictional level. So noting that we've just had all of our presentations, I would very much like to welcome George and Fiona and Ian back to the virtual stage so we can have a bit of a chat. So effectively, it's been really great getting that background from everyone. But before we go to the question from the Q&A, and I note there's only one question in the Q&A at present, so I would encourage people to ask more questions. I'm just going to kick us off with a few different queries. So George, noting all of the work that has been happened to improve energy efficiency within data centers, do you foresee that we're going to be able to continue to improve energy efficiency in data centers, or have we reached a plateau?
Yeah, it's the, I guess, billion-dollar question at this point. I mean, there's, I guess, two kind of main uncertainties. So one is, how much will service demand continue to grow? So will it grow at historical rates, or will it even accelerate into the future with, these emerging technologies like machine learning? And then how quickly can, these ASICs or other kind of efficiency measures keep pace? So I don't think anybody really knows definitively. So far, at least at least historically over the last 10 years, the data points to very good progress. That's no guarantee, I think, to say that energy use will remain flat or only moderately increasing into the future. So I highlighted the Facebook example, but if you look at any of the large data center operators, their energy consumption is growing quite rapidly. So in the order of 15, 20, 25% per year. Of course, at some point, there's going to be a saturation of some of those markets and users, but that certainly is concerning. Like Ian said, there's been a huge gain from shifting to cloud and hyperscale data centers. So much higher utilization data centers compared to these enterprise data centers that, are, even when they're not doing much work, they're still consuming a lot of power. So I guess my concern is that kind of that migration is starting to slow down and to plateau. And there's at a point at which I think enterprises are going to, be using hybrid solutions. So there's going to be less of this traditional data center workload to shift to the cloud. So I'm concerned, but also I think these companies are also highly innovative. I think policies need to definitely push them to kind of invest into next generation technologies. But the short answer is nobody knows, and I think if anybody says they know, it's you should ask some tough questions.
I really love it when effectively you end up sitting on the fence, but that's okay, George. Like that's reasonable. With that in mind, noting the role of policies and indeed the report that Fiona you led on, it's really highlighting best practice around the world in terms of policies and standards and building codes with supporting data centers with reducing energy efficiency. I'm curious to know, or not reducing energy efficiency, apologies, reducing energy consumption, improving energy efficiency. With that in mind, Fiona, I'm curious to know where you think the greatest added value in governments working internationally through forums such as the IEA EBC is. So why is it important for governments to come together to share this best practice?
Yes, I think, it's one aspect of that is that data centers to some extent are an international phenomenon, and not completely, but there is scope for people talk about carbon leakage, but if there is one area where data centers might get an easier deal or whatever, they might migrate to that area. So some degree of coordination is important, but it's also technologically they're the same pretty much wherever they are. Obviously the climate they operate in is different. So I think internationally there's a lot in common to work across, and in the report I identify 3 areas where it would be particularly helpful to sort of pool everybody's expertise. One of them is, that's come up I think in everybody's talk, is the metrics, and just finding a good way of measuring this, how much work IT is doing in a way that's consistent, and you can then equate to efficiency. It's doing this much work to with this much energy. So that's one area. Another is that the huge focus understandably has been on energy use, which has got carbon emissions, but data centers, both directly in terms of cooling and also indirectly in terms of their energy use a lot of water, and water is becoming a more scarce resource, and it needs an area that is seen as needing more attention. So working internationally on that. And then finally, again, it's been alluded to, there's this move, there is this huge consolidation and cloud, but partly as a result of that, but also new technologies, 5G, virtual reality, industrial internet. There's more requirement for very fast reactive data analysis, which needs to be close to the point of use, which is called edge computing. And that is on a sort of different scale and different way of operating to the conventional data centers. And the more conventional policy tools may not apply so effectively to those. So I think that's one area where it's, again, it's worth pooling expertise and doing some work together on.
It's really great to hear, and it's important to note that obviously energy and water matter in different ways, but also thinking about something like water, pumping water around also uses energy. So there's, the direct use of energy in the actual data centers, but then there's the indirect use of energy for moving all that water around. But really great to think that it isn't just energy when we're thinking about international collaboration. Thanks, Fiona. So I've got another question now for Ian in particular, which is, what other forms does current or proposed regulation of data centers take in the US? And do you have advice for governments in other jurisdictions looking to take similar actions? Ian, you are definitely on mute.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that there is a move afoot to encourage the EPA, for example, to expand upon its standards for equipment in data centers. As George pointed out, though, that problem gets a little difficult when you start having these custom-made chips. It's difficult for a standard writing organization like EPA to get a handle on something that is so customized for data centers. It's easy enough for the kind of commercial off-the-shelf stuff that's in your standard enterprise systems. I guess I should point out that it's always going to be a bit of a mixed bag. George made reference to the emergence of hybrid cloud types of arrangements. I think that that's a pretty de rigueur right now in the United States. That there are a lot of folks who are, keeping some of their data close to the vest and migrating as much as they can to the cloud. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Not less. That's going to be the emergent model. Let's see what else. I think I don't know if we're going to get into talking about crypto mining, but I do think there is specifically an interest there in Congress in the United States among some quarters and also in the environmental community. And obviously, the folks with ASHRAE, who have worked for years and years and years to develop these standards, really would like to see those standards turned into codes and applied around the country. Right now, we have an explosion of data centers on the eastern coast around Washington, around Northern Virginia, and so on. And right now, that's largely unaddressed by any kind of building energy code.
So getting back to basics and actually having codes in jurisdictions or states that don't have them is really central to moving us along. And it is good to note that there are some really good standards out there like ASHRAE's to support these businesses with reducing their energy consumption in data centers. So thanks for that, Ian. That's a really useful roundup. Well, we've got a couple of questions from the virtual floor, and I'd like to go to Danielle King's question first, which I suspect is best directed towards George, but after George, I'm definitely happy for Fiona or Ian to jump in. So George, for those with enterprise data centers like banks or technology companies, what would be your top 3 things to do to reduce energy usage?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I can't say I'm an operational expert in data centers, so maybe Ian can add. But yeah, I mean, I think what she's highlighted here, efficient cooling, upgrading hardware, optimization. I mean, the simplest solution may be kind of some hybrid solution where you can migrate some of the workloads to the cloud. But I guess the other aspect with cloud and hyperscale data centers is that I think I mentioned in the slides that some of them are purchasing a lot of renewable PPAs to offset their electricity consumption. Some of that is it's done on a global basis, so it's not like a one-to-one. Every electron that's going into a data center is necessarily green. But in particular, if you're kind of situated in a region with high carbon electricity, migrating some of those services to a greener grid, operating a data center operating in a greener grid could make sense on a carbon basis. But others have alluded to this, but kind of there's this trade-off between, I guess, refreshing hardware and embodied emissions. So that's something to be aware of as well. But LBNL has written, I think many reports on small and medium-sized data centers and efficiency opportunities. So hopefully Ian can add to that.
Well, with that, I'm very happy for Ian to go next. So George, like at a high level, we're effectively saying the opportunity to move to the cloud generally means you'd be moving to a more energy efficient, larger data center. The opportunity to get renewables involved as well is really important, and then really just thinking about technological improvements. But Ian, do you have some more, I want to say, basic opportunities around things like heating and cooling?
Yeah, I think one that's underappreciated, not on this panel, but in general, that is heat recovery. And right now, I mean, most of the non-cloud data centers that we're talking about, they're co-located with office space or some other kind of building that requires some heating, and so there's always this opportunity for both heating and for hot water heating. Frankly, you've got, in essence, a toaster, and so why not have it do useful work as opposed to having to expend energy in order to eject that heat. And so in the United States, there's been some steps towards incentivizing that by allowing folks who are complying with the commercial building codes to take credit, to take efficiency credit when they take heat from a data center. I can't tell you right now how prevalent, how much folks are taking advantage of that. But I think it's also fair to say that we do see folks, particularly on the hyperscale side, but I think increasingly also on in individual buildings, trying to establish on-site renewables, primarily PV on the roof, and at least be able to offset at least some of, to introduce low or zero emissions as a source. Lastly, I think I would just, we're lucky in a way. I mean, that this industry is, yes, it's growing by leaps and bounds, but it is inherently electrified. It's unlike huge other segments of the economy where they're highly thermal and that reliant upon fossil fuels. We're already kind of halfway there in a sense in terms of addressing and being able to power these things with renewables. And so, yes, we've got a lot to talk about and a lot to do, but there is we're a leg up versus some of the other sectors of the economy.
Yeah, it's a really great point. But just reiterating for everyone, just because we can have renewable electricity doesn't mean that energy efficiency doesn't matter, because it obviously supports with reliability of the grid and other things like health and comfort in the buildings. And I appreciate, Ian, you weren't saying that at all, but I would be at a loss to not remind everyone of that as the Energy Efficiency Council.
Absolutely.
Fiona, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Do you have any thoughts about what's a high priority for improvements?
No, I think George and Ian have covered that off nicely. Thank you.
Perfect. I've got a more technical question, which definitely gets me excited about the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol. So we've got a question from James McLean, who's interested whether IPMVP can be used to assess data center energy improvements and monetize these improvements through carbon credits. So for anybody that's not familiar with the international protocol, it's basically the protocol for measurement and verification of energy savings of a project. It's used quite heavily with energy efficiency or white certificate schemes around the world, of which there are a number in Australia, but there are a number in the US and in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. I'm unsure if anybody's particularly familiar with M&V, so I'm going to go to Ian in the first instance. Do you have any thoughts on whether or not we could be using M&V to basically calculate the savings from these upgrades and be using that to generate carbon credits within a offsetting scheme?
We definitely could, and we're kind of already edging in that direction in the United States to some degree, with the use of ESPCs, of energy service performance companies, in order to support the finance of their retrofits or of data centers. There is an emergent kind of framework for M&V in order to measure what those savings are going to be and be able to kind of monetize them. That hasn't the extra step of going ahead and accounting for carbon credits using that kind of scheme. I don't think it's been done, but I just may not have heard about it. But I guess I will. This is a self-serving plug, but the U.S. Department of Energy will be issuing a report on the application of M&V to data centers, hopefully within the next 6 months.
Well, that's very exciting, Ian, and I'm sure we can circulate that around to everybody that's attended today so that they see that when that does come out. With that in mind, so basically it hasn't happened yet, but theoretically, yes, it could apply. Fiona, when you were doing research for the report, did you come across anything to do with M&V in data centres and how it could be used to support programs that reduce energy consumption? I keep going to say reduce energy efficiency. I'm blaming the morning here in Australia. It's not my time of day. But Fiona, is there anything in particular when you were doing the research that came up about M&V?
So a number of the schemes that I talked about have set targets in different ways. I think so it does happen, but I think we are up against, to some extent, this issue of not having a really good metric for measuring IT work, and therefore being able to say satisfactorily, yes, this is saving compared to where it was. So I think if we could address that, that would make everybody's lives a lot easier and make it more robust.
That's really useful. Thanks, Fiona. With that in mind, it is now 1 minute to 12:30 wherever you are in the world. So I might do a wrap up so that you can all either get to bed if you're in George or Fiona's part of the world, or finish your work day if you're in Ian's part of the world, and indeed start your work day down here in the Southern Hemisphere, or not Southern Hemisphere, but in Australia more broadly. So really appreciate everybody joining us today. I really want to thank Fiona, George and Ian, and indeed David, Jeff and Stanford earlier on for contributing to this session. Thanks to all of you for attending and engaging with the discussion. We really hope that you read the report so that you can learn best practice in terms of supporting energy efficiency in data centres in your home country. And definitely, last but not least, I'd really like to thank some of the behind the scenes legends, being Alison and Meredith in the US, and indeed Cassie and Julianne here in Australia. Without the four of these wonderful women, we would not have got this webinar up. So thanks so much for them doing all of that behind the scenes work. So with that in mind, thanks for getting up early or for being in late, and I hope you all have a fantastic day, or today or tomorrow. Thanks everyone.